Okay, coming up for air, part two. Part two. Sorry about this. My original plan, I knew I was going to kind of ramble for a long time. My original plan was to just, whenever the camera cut me off at that 30-minute time limit, I just kind of end it there and figure 30 minutes is enough, I've said my piece. But I got to the end of 30 minutes, the camera shut down, and I realized I hadn't even gotten to the main part of the book. Like, I hadn't even talked about the main themes. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to do a part two now. Sorry about this. I don't know what's wrong with me. I've been looking at some of the other reviews for this book online, on YouTube. And I think the longest one I found was 12 minutes. A lot of them were 4 minutes. I'm the only one I know who just rambles for an hour about these books and has to make 2 videos because 30 minutes just isn't enough. As always, you're under no obligation to watch this, so if I'm just kind of rambling on and making no sense, just turn the video off. But I felt like, yeah, I had to do a second video because I didn't even get to the meat of the book in the first video. Okay, so what's the meat of the book? So it's got a lot of themes like I was talking about in the first video, kind of all that stuff. But if it's possible to pick out kind of a major theme, it's the change in society after the war. And the war in this case meaning World War I. At the time this book was published in 1939, that was still the war. Although, again, like I said, Orwell is looking ahead to the next one by 1939. But there hadn't been a World War II yet. So the main character, gets his memory of his childhood triggered by kind of something he reads in the newspapers. Which sets off kind of a chain of associations, you know how these things go, which eventually kind of gets him remembering all sorts of details about his childhood. And he realizes that this kind of life that he used to know growing up in a small town in England before the war has been completely lost and has been replaced by kind of a modern society. Now, he talks a lot. A lot of the book is a flashback, kind of an extended flashback, kind of going over all of his life before the war, where he talks about fishing and kind of hanging out with, playing hooky from school with the boys and going on walks with the neighborhood kids and kind of the stuff they would eat, the kind of old time sweets that used to be sold in the sweet shop for a penny, all the kind of berries and nuts they would eat along the way, the fish in the River Thames, some of the fights they would get into. It's very well described, and it does kind of make you think as you read the book, boy, that world is gone. Although it's interesting because, I think there may be a sense in which each generation thinks that they're the ones who have lost innocence, right? So I kind of tend to think nowadays, these kids with their smartphones nowadays and the internet and the iPads, why can't we just go back to the way things were in the 1970s when people had real childhoods and stuff like that? And it's interesting to see that Orwell, writing in 1939, is talking about the age of kind of lost childhoods and kind of the times before modern life ruined everything. So maybe it was one of these things that was always thus. Well, not always, because kind of the change of modern society has really kicked into gear since the Industrial Revolution, right? Probably like the ancient Romans didn't sit around talking about how much life had changed. Although maybe they did. I don't know. So it is interesting that kind of all the way back in 1939, in an era kind of we associate with being old-fashioned, Orwell is talking about how modern life has kind of completely ruined everything. But Yeah, you definitely get the sense reading about kind of this pastoral childhood, or kind of childhood spent out in a small town in England, kind of fishing and collecting birds and frogs and stuff like that. You get the sense that kind of world is gone now, and it's a pity. It's to his credit, Orwell does take pains not to overly romanticize it. So he talks about, how they would find birds' nests and then just kind of stomp on all the baby birds. Or they'd find a toad and then they'd stick a bicycle pump up the toad's backside and then pump the toad up till it exploded. And he just said, yeah, boys are like that. Who knows why, but there's this kind of cruel streak running through all boys. And yeah, he also talks about, somebody's cousin who drowned in the river because he got tangled up with the weeds. And then these are just kind of little asides, but then he goes on this extended passage where he blatantly says, look, I don't want to overly romanticize this. Life was hard back then. And talks about all the people living in poverty and kind of getting sent to the workhouse and kind of all this kind of stuff. But, he said, life was real then. Well, yeah, that was part of it. Life was real. I think another part of his point was that people kind of knew what they were doing. Is that the best way to describe it? He says, like, nowadays we're always kind of like in this constant fear about like getting fired from work, or like finding work during the Depression, or the next wave of bombs coming over from Germany or stuff like that. He said we're always living in kind of constant fear. Back then, people weren't afraid about what was coming. He's like, life was tough, but everybody knew it, so you didn't have this kind of vague fear of the future. Although, he's also kind of saying throughout these kind of flashbacks that life was changing then, and people didn't know it. So he talks about his father, who was running a small shop and was going out of business because his father didn't know what was happening to him with these kind of big supermarkets opening up that were putting the small shops out of business. His father thought, if you just do your trade honestly, things will work out for you. So, yeah, in that sense, maybe there's a sense where people should have been a little bit more afraid of the future than they were. But yeah, I guess life was simpler back then, maybe harder, but simpler. So he goes on this extended kind of reminiscing about the way life was back then and how the modern world has kind of changed everything. And then the main character decides to go back to his hometown to just kind of get away from a week and, I don't know, recapture his childhood or go fishing again. Or it's a little bit vague, and kind of the main character himself doesn't really know what he wants out of it or what to expect. But he's got this idea that he can get some peace by kind of going back to his childhood hometown. So he gets a week off work. He kind of lies to his wife about where he's going. And then he goes back to his hometown. And yeah, I trust I'm not spoiling anything when I say everything had changed and he can't recover his childhood. And in fact, even in the narration, the narrator alludes to the fact that the reader must have seen this coming already. The narrator says, okay, reader, I know you knew this was coming, but I didn't. I meaning the narrator. He says, you the reader knew that this shock was coming for me all along. But I, the narrator, didn't realize until I saw the town and how much it had changed. Now, basically what's happened is his little kind of small town has been swallowed up by industrialization and urban sprawl. So kind of all these kind of suburbs and houses kind of going out and kind of covering up all the old fishing ponds and forests and these kind of factories. Now, I'm going to bring in some other stuff here. I recently, I guess within the past couple years, read this book called The Intellectuals and the Masses, which a friend was nice enough to send me. In fact, I reviewed this book on a separate YouTube video. And it's an interesting book. Basically, the premise of this book is kind of right around the turn of the century, kind of the early 20th century. There was a population explosion in Europe, particularly, I guess the author focuses on England here, but maybe Europe in general. And there were all these British intellectuals who were writing books about how the masses were just kind of swallowing everything. And it's such a pity that there are these kind of unwashed crowds kind of wandering everywhere and ruining everything. It's an interesting argument presented in this book because the author, John Carey, if I'm reading him right, is saying, like, on the one hand, they're kind of right, like the urban sprawl and kind of this population explosion was really changing the landscape of England. On the other hand, he's saying they were in danger of falling into some kind of very elitist rhetoric about population control and kind of how the masses of the crowds lived lives that didn't really matter and were ruining everything. And on the extreme end of this, he says if you took this to the extreme, then you wind up with Hitler, who had plans to kind of control the population and eugenics. It's an interesting read, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of his argument or if he's being fair, but regardless, this book falls squarely into that period. The other book, which this author also talks about, and which I've also reviewed within the last year or so on this YouTube channel, is Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is most famous for being a book about love, but also contains long digressions talking about how much the town was changing because of industrialization and how the old town was being swallowed up. And this was written relatively around the same time as this one. I think this was in the 1920s, this was in the 1930s, so, like 10, 15 years difference. But kind of round about the same era, the interwar years. So having read both of these two books, that helped me to put this in perspective a little bit, that this was kind of a big theme or big concern of the times about how these small towns in this English countryside was just kind of getting swallowed up by urban sprawl. And yeah, the narrator here goes to great lengths to kind of say, look, I'm not anti-people, which is, I guess what John Carey kind of accuses some of these intellectuals of doing. But Orwell was saying over and over again, or Orwell or his narrator, whichever it is, look, I'm not anti-people. I understand people have to live somewhere. They may as well live here as somewhere else. Blah, 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 blah. People have to live. He says that over and over again. But he also says it's a shame. This way of life is gone. He talks about trying to go fishing on the Thames, but it's so overcrowded by people. He goes back to one of the fish ponds that he remembered as a boy, and they've turned it into a rubbish dump. And that's right about the point where he's got his fill of his trip back to his hometown. And he says, that's the modern world for you. They've turned it into one big rubbish dump. You go anywhere you like. You can't escape it now. And again, this is one of those things that if Orwell was complaining about it all the way back in 1939, but definitely feels much more true now than it was then, doesn't it? All these videos about the beaches with the plastic washing up on them and the oceans being filled with trash and everything. Maybe Orwell just kind of got the first glimpse of what was coming. And then now we're kind of seeing it now with the rubbish dumps everywhere and trash everywhere and stuff like that. Which I would be a hypocrite if I didn't point out that I was part of the problem. I shop at convenience stores and kind of load up on plastic cartridges and bring home my stuff in plastic bags just as much as the next person. But, you know, regardless of whose fault it is, that kind of is the modern world, isn't it? So it's, it's one of these you can't go home again stories, or talking about how much things have changed. And again, apparently, according to this book, this was a common theme in literature at the time because the population really was exploding and there was lots of urban sprawl. That being said, it is kind of one of these universal things that no matter when you live, no matter what age, you go back to your hometown and you see changes, and it bugs you that things have changed while you've been away, right? Because you've been like, no. This is the way it was. That's the way I remember it. You can't change it now. But they do. I mean, you can't stop these things. It's just part of life. It's strange when you think about it. Maybe it's strange that we get so attached to our nostalgia. Maybe that's just kind of this quirk of human nature that who knows why evolution has given this to us or whatever. But we do. We get attached to our childhood views of things. Yeah, there are more themes in here, but I know I've rattled on long enough. So I'm just going to shut the video off now. I think I've said most of what I wanted to say.